Again, good evening, everyone. Pastor Mark Olson from Faith Lutheran in Bagley, Minnesota. And I'm trying once more to try to get this video broadcast. I had to change some settings on my microphone, and I think that's done now. Last week we did an introduction to the book of Ruth. And I offered you some optional homework. First of all, to read the first chapter. And then what do you hear? What do you notice? What stands out to you? And secondly, to reflect upon your own migration story. Have you ever lived in a place other than where you were born or raised? And what motivated you to move? And what was that experience like? I'm going to read the first half of Ruth 1, really the darkest point of the book. Where we deal with famine and death and plagues that strikes Naomi's family, and of course by marriage Ruth's and family as well. I'm going to ask you in the comments section to type in, what do you hear? What do you notice? What words or phrases grab your attention? And then, like I said, type them into the comments section on your screen. So here's Ruth 1, the first 14 verses. In the days when the judges ruled, again, this is Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and so forth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, which means weak or frail in the Hebrew, and the name of his wife, Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. What is the meaning of Bethlehem? It's the city of David, as we'll find out, as Ruth is a descendant of David, a descendant of Jesus. It is the city of bread. But here's a famine in the city of bread. They're Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the other was Ruth. And when they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons of her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had consideration for his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then they kissed them and they wept aloud. They said to her, No, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that you may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Hey, Marianne. Again, if you wanted to type into the comments what words or phrases caught your attention as I read that first 14 verses of Ruth, you're welcome to do so. Here's a few things that I want to pick out that I think have particular relevance for our time. Again, as I briefly stated it before I began reading, these 14 verses are really the darkest part of Ruth's story. And the beauty and kind of the pathos and the love story and the hope, or really maybe the happily ever after, will come after this. That's one of the nice reasons to study this in this difficult time of pandemic and potential famine, as we'll get to that very shortly here. In order to get to the hope, to get to the security, to get to the promise message, we've got to go through this dark part of the story, this part that deals with tragedy and death. The first phrase that caught my attention this time, particularly in the times that we're living in right now, is the phrase, "There was a famine in the land," that there was a famine in the land of bread, Bethlehem, the city of bread. Now, famine and plague historically have been closely associated, that one often either precludes or comes before the other. Take, for instance, certainly up until the time that we're living in right now, because we don't know the ending of the coronavirus pandemic and what that might lead us to. But in human history, the greatest plague was the Black Plague, or the Black Death of the 14th century. 75 to 200 million people globally were killed by that. Estimates are that there were somewhere around 500 million people living on the earth at that time. So as potentially as many as a third of the population of the global population perished in the Black Plague, or the Black Death. And where we have a little bit closer records, almost certainly a third of the people that were living in Europe at that time. Now, here's where famine and plague, in an awful sense, feed each other. According to the Harvard Review, historical researchers believe that famine in Northern Europe before the plague came ashore and weakened the population and really set the stage for the devastation. A widespread famine weakened the population over decades, and that could explain the Black Death's particularly high mortality. Thanks, Tony, for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about how plague and famine in a little bit particularly affect our indigenous communities, communities of color, and the vulnerability that are there, the vulnerabilities that are there. Right now, as we face the coronavirus, one of the great threats is, rather than that famine occurring on the front end of this pandemic, it may very well occur on the back end. CNN reports that the world is facing multiple famines of, quote, biblical proportions in just a matter of months. The UN has said, warning that the coronavirus will push an additional 130 million people to the brink of starvation. Food supply lines have been devastated because of this. Dr. Sharita Golden from Johns Hopkins wrote an article called "Famine and Plague in America, People of Color, Coronavirus and African Americans and Other People of Color." Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland is really one of our leading centers of study of illness and sickness and pandemic. And Dr. Golden particularly has looked at the threat that has for minority communities. Again, let's remember that Naomi is a Moabite. She is a part of a minority community too. And so this story has a particular edge to it, where we're dealing with a cross-cultural story, the Moabites and the Jews right here. Dr. Golden writes that in Chicago, where African Americans comprise a third of the city's population, they account for half of those who have tested positive for the coronavirus, and almost 3/4 of the COVID-19 deaths in Chicago are of those of African American descent. Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, African Americans make up 70% of the deaths due to the coronavirus, but just 26% of the county's population. So what are the reasons for that? And then Dr. Golden goes on to list some of the reasons why minority communities or communities of poverty are particularly susceptible to the coronavirus. They are often, number one, living in crowded conditions. I know from my experience working in Leech Lake and White Earth that there's a hidden homeless population that are often doubling up and staying with aunties or grandmas, grandpas. And when one person might lose government or tribal housing, they'll move in for a period of time with others. Jeannie Roper runs the homeless shelter in Cass Lake, and she could document that. I'm sure certainly more than I could. Sue Kesterman runs Churches United from the Homeless. She's a fellow ELCA pastor. On Tuesday, we were in a Zoom discussion with our bishop and about 75, 80 other ELCA pastors throughout northwestern Minnesota. The coronavirus is starting to find its way into the shelters of Fargo-Moorhead, and that potentially, as people are living in crowded housing conditions there and in our reservations, there's a threat there. Lots of people in poverty work in essential fields, and we know with President Trump's decision to open up the pork and the beef packing plants, where there have been spikes, that unfortunately that essential work of providing food, again, the back of the end of this could end up in a famine. That a lot of our minority folks, our people of color, are working in those very vulnerable settings. Inconsistent access to health care. Due to lack of insurance or underinsurance, people in poverty, again, are susceptible. They're at risk. And then chronic health conditions, poverty and famine, if you will. Food insecurity equals poorer health. When I worked with the Cass Lake Food Shelf and worked with the board of directors there, we noted, by the way, that's just amazing work, that the churches of Cass Lake are helping to run a food shelf in conjunction with the Commods building, the Tribal Center for Food Distribution, and that food distribution network that we have access to their coolers and the west end of their building over there. It's really an amazing interfaith, intercultural, city resources, tribal resources, feeding people and hungry. But in the midst of working with that board, we did some research and we found that the greatest food deserts in Minnesota aren't necessarily in the Twin Cities or in large areas of poverty, but food deserts are in our reservations, where people often lack vehicles or the capacity to get to from Rice Lake or White Earth to get to Bagley and get access to food. And getting that food to Rice Lake because of poverty or maybe not having a car is a challenge. I don't know how many times many of you I'm on Facebook with, and somebody in Onagum is saying, "Hey, is anybody going to town? I need to get some food. Can I ride with you?" And people double up in that way too. Chronic health conditions of poverty and famine and food insecurity are real. And then there's the issue of stress. Stress affects our immunity. There's a lot of research that's been gone into that. A great book by Basil van der Kolk called "The Body Keeps Score" talks about even at a genetic level, when trauma has influenced us, it codes our genes in what's called a study of epigenetics. And so that fight, flight, or freeze impact creates ACEs inventories and other adverse childhood experiences, changes our DNA and makes us even more susceptible to disease and famine, and our immune systems become depressed because of that. So many of those same factors are true in our Ojibwe communities here in the White Earth Reservation. As of yesterday, according to CNN, the Navajo Nation down in the Southwest has lost more people to coronavirus than 13 states combined. So what does all that have to do with Ruth? Again, Ruth is a minority, a Moabite, who is trying to enter back into a culture where she's an outsider into the Jewish culture. That is at the very center of the conflict. Um, Last week, I quoted L. Daniel Hawk's commentary, Apollos Old Testament commentary on Ruth, and he lays out the conflict that exists really throughout the book of Ruth in this way. He writes, Ruth is a Moabite, a foreigner, living in Israel's Bethlehem. Ruth the Moabite enters Israel's social and geographical space uninvited and probably unwanted. The ensuing drama grapples with the import of the foreigner's presence among the descendants of Jacob. How should Israelites deal with outsiders who attach themselves to their nation and to their God? The whole book of Ruth is somewhat a counter commentary in Deuteronomy, where it says no Moabites up to the 10th generation should be allowed in the temple of God and into our sacred ceremonies. They are forbidden. Ezra and Nehemiah are also two books of the Old Testament that create those deep restrictions. I talked earlier about Lot sleeping with his daughters in the caves. In Genesis, the daughters, the eldest daughter said, "Let's get Dad drunk now that Sodom has been destroyed and we're living in this cave and we may not have any descendants." So she got Lot drunk and slept with him and then she gives birth to Moab, the father of the Moabite people. So there's all sorts of prejudice against Ruth as she, as we'll find out, enters back into Bethlehem, into the land of Judah, with her mother-in-law, with Naomi. Built into this story is crossing boundaries and immigration issues and all that too. That's been a prevailing part of our culture and our time. Other things to pick out in our reading tonight is the phrases that have to do with what is God up to in this? How is God allowing or not allowing this famine to occur, these deaths to occur? And Naomi at times wants to attach her sorrow to God. In verse 6, for example, this is after the deaths. Naomi had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered for his people and had given them food. She hears that there's food back in Bethlehem, that the Lord has given consideration for his people and given them food. Is it the agency or the providence of God that has caused food and the end of the famine in Naomi's homeland, in the land of Judah? And then later in verse 9, Naomi addresses Orpah and Ruth, her daughters-in-law. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband, that the Lord may grant you security. Stay in Moab so that the Lord might grant you security here. Again, here's a real universal sense of the Lord, that the Lord does not just exist in Bethlehem, not just in Judah, that indeed you, Orpah and Ruth, may fall more deeply under the Lord's favor if you stay in Moab and I go back. And there's this tension, this push-pull, as I read earlier in the latter part of these 9 through 14. Should I stay or should I go now? Isn't that a Talking Head song or something like that? This back and forth, should we stay with Naomi and go back with her and believe that the Lord has promised bread back in the land of Bethlehem? Or should we stay in Moab? Better the hell we know than the hell we don't know. And as we'll find out next week, indeed, Orpah decides to stay back in Moab, but Ruth goes with Naomi. But even in this, that Naomi knows that the Lord exists in Moab too. That the Lord doesn't just exist in the land of Judah, and that the Lord may grant you and let you have greater security if you stay in Moab than if you come with me. Again, we never really know what happens to Orpah, and if indeed the Lord has favor with her in her decision to stay. Finally, again, in verse 12, Ruth speaks, or Naomi speaks again about God's hand in all of this. She says, "No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Here again, it seems that, just seeing if we have any other comments, that Naomi is willing to ascribe her ill fortune, the awful things that has happened to her, to the providence of God, that the hand of the Lord has turned against me. Now, wait a minute, Naomi, because your story is going to change in the verses in the chapters to come. That's a huge part of this story, folks. And I'm just gonna about wrap up here tonight. Is this a story about God's providence, or is it a story about human agency? Talked about that a little bit last. Is the grit of Naomi and Ruth, their refusal to die, their willingness now to go back to Judah, to Bethlehem, and to cling to one another, as we'll find out next week. That's your homework assignment, by the way, for next week, is to read the rest of Ruth chapter 1. And if you want to read ahead again, you can as well. Does God use gritty people? Might be another way to ask that question. The other thing for your the homework assignment is to ask yourselves, when people decide to move or to change, are they being pushed out? Are there forces that are pushing them, or is there a pull? And what are the pushes and the pulls of this migration story? How are Naomi and Ruth pushed or pulled in the first chapter of Ruth? Those questions, if you do have the workbook at home, those questions are on pages 10 and 11 of session 1. And verses 15, and we'll be reading verses 15 to 22 for next week of chapter 1. Again, questions that we're going to think about and dwell upon next week are: what kinds of work are attracting immigrants to our community, to Bagley or Stephen, to the Elk River area? What pull is there? We know that a lot of our folks from Bagley, for that matter, end up finding jobs in the Twin Cities area. What is the pull to live there? And then maybe there are those who decide that they don't want to live in the Twin Cities, and there's a push to perhaps go back. What are the pushes and the pulls in Minnesota? We might even want to think about this. It seems like it's not nearly as much of a front page issue now, but the migration across the border in Mexico and into the United States. I'm also going to spend some time, and actually this was really for the first session, I'm pushing it off just a little bit, is this picture. And you might want to even Google this. I found it very easily. And it's again in the, for those of you that are using the Augsburg commentary, this picture by, it's called Me Voy, translated I Am Going, by Pedro Chave Tolk, is this picture that shows a man leaving his wife and his 2 children. The village that they live in is awfully densely populated. He's leaving, he's barefoot, and he's me voy, I go, or I am going, as he goes off to look for work. And what is he being pushed out of a village? Is he being pulled? A neat kind of artwork for us to meditate on. Again, if you want to try to find that online, I'm going to type that in here. It is Me Voy by Pedro Shava Joy J. Toke. And you can Google that. In Google Images. And it should pop up. That's about all I've got for tonight. We've gone for about 25 minutes. That's going to be our typical time. Again, enjoy the story of Ruth. And we went through the darkest part of that story tonight. And we will be hearing really just the beautiful words of promise that come out of that story in the verses to come, the really the happily ever after story coming out of famine and pandemic. Before we close tonight, I'd like to offer a word of prayer. Gracious God, in these uncertain times, we do not know the ending of this this journey that we have been placed upon, this time of sheltering in place. But we know that somewhere in the midst of what we don't know, your hand is with us, that you sent your son Jesus into a world to suffer and die with us, but also to give us a message of hope and love and security. Be with us this night. In the days to come, we particularly think of Naomi as an outsider and a foreigner, and the danger and the fear that she faced, but also those who are part of our minority communities who are facing the brunt of the virus here too. Help us to see a greater vision of what it means to be God's people, whether we live in Moab or Judah or northern Minnesota, White Earth, Leech Lake, or wherever we find ourselves this night, Elk River, that you are here and that your right hand holds us fast. Even as Jesus said that the sheep are sometimes to be held in the comfort of the sheepfold, be with us this night. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. If I should live for other days, I ask the Lord to guide my ways. We live, we die, and we rise in that sort of hope, O Lord. Be with us. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all. God bless you for tonight. And we'll be back together on next Thursday. Also, we'll be posting on this channel our YouTube worship. It's kind of weird. We recorded the worship service this morning that will air on Sunday. So I'm going to be sitting in my pajamas watching worship with you too on Sunday. And the nice thing about that is if the preacher gets too long, you can always mute him and drink your coffee and worship from home. God bless you all. Have a wonderful night.